Imagine the creak of wooden boards, the sour stench of disease, and the restless fear of every breath you take. On a plague ship, sleep was nearly impossible. Rats scurried under hammocks. The air was thick with sickness, and every cough in the dark could mean death. Tonight, we gently sail back to these grim waters, exploring the chilling reality of life and restless nights. Aboard a ship no one wanted to board. If stories from history's darker corners still help you find calm, you're in the right place. Dust. Subscribe now and tap the bell icon to keep uncovering these forgotten, eerie bedtime tales. Before we continue, I'd love to know where are you listening from and what time is it for you? It's always amazing to see how far our quiet little stories are reaching. You find yourself standing on the deck of a merchant galley as it approaches the magnificent city of Venice in the year 1485. The morning mist clings to the water's surface like a shroud, and through it you can see the distant spires and domes of what was once called the most beautiful city in the world. But your ship will not be docking today, nor tomorrow, nor for the next 39 days. Instead, you watch as the harbor master's smaller vessel approaches, its occupants wrapped in protective cloth, their faces obscured by primitive masks stuffed with aromatic herbs. The quarantine system that would trap you and your fellow passengers had been refined over more than a century of plague outbreaks. Venice, that great maritime republic, had watched the Black Death arrive in 1348 aboard ships much like yours, carrying not just goods and travelers, but the microscopic agents of devastation. The city's response was revolutionary for its time, the creation of the world's first systematic maritime quarantine. A 40-day period of isolation that gave the practice its name, derived from the Italian quaranta giorni. As the harbor officials board your vessel, you notice their methodical inspection process. They examine not just the passengers and crew, but every piece of cargo, every bolt of silk, every barrel of spices. Their questions are precise and repetitive. Where did you last port? How many days since departure? Has anyone fallen ill during the voyage? The answers determine your fate, and as you provide them, you realize that the slight fever you've been ignoring might not be as insignificant as you'd hoped. The merchant galley that serves as your temporary prison is a vessel designed for commerce, not comfort. Measuring roughly 130 feet in length and 20 feet in width, it represents the pinnacle of Mediterranean shipbuilding technology. The ship's design prioritizes cargo space and rowing efficiency over passenger amenities, a reality that becomes painfully apparent as you begin to understand the true nature of your confinement. The lower deck, where you and most of the other passengers are housed, is a dimly lit space barely 5 feet high at its tallest point. The curved hull creates an environment where only the central walkway allows a person of average height to stand upright. Along the sides, wooden platforms serve as both seating during the day and sleeping surfaces at night. These platforms, rough-hewn and splintered from years of use, are arranged in tiers that maximize the number of people who can be accommodated while minimizing the space required. Your assigned sleeping area measures roughly 6 feet by 2 feet, barely larger than a coffin. The wooden planks are worn smooth by countless previous occupants, mean you can see the dark stains where previous passengers have slept, eaten, been sick, and sometimes died. The bedding provided consists of a thin straw mattress that crackles with every movement and a coarse woolen blanket that smells of previous occupants and the salt air that permeates everything aboard the ship. The straw in your mattress is not fresh. Maritime quarantine regulations specify that all bedding must be fumigated with aromatic herbs before use. But this process does little to eliminate the insects that have made their home in the straw. As you settle into your assigned space for the first night, you feel the familiar tickle of fleas beginning their nightly feast. The blanket, though welcome in the cool evening air, carries the musty smell of wool that has been repeatedly soaked in seawater and dried in the sun. Privacy is a concept that ceases to exist within the confines of the quarantine galley. The wooden partitions that separate the sleeping areas are low and offer no real barrier to sound or sight. Every conversation, every cough, every intimate moment of personal hygiene becomes part of the collective experience. You can hear the merchant from Milan discussing his business concerns in whispered tones with his traveling companion, while from the other direction comes the sound of a woman from Florence, quietly weeping for children she fears she may never see again. The ship's crew, though they maintain their regular duties, are as much prisoners as the passengers. They sleep in equally cramped quarters, though their familiarity with shipboard life provides them with small advantages in managing the discomfort. The crew knows which areas of the ship are slightly warmer, where the drafts are less severe, and how to arrange their few possessions to create the illusion of personal space. Food preparation and consumption present their own challenges within the quarantine system. The ship's galley, a small brick-lined firebox located on the upper deck, operates under constant supervision from Venetian health officials. Every meal must be prepared from ingredients that have been approved and fumigated. The process is slow and inefficient, resulting in a diet that consists primarily of hardtack, a type of long-lasting biscuit that becomes the foundation of nearly every meal. The hardtack itself is a marvel of preservation technology, designed to remain edible for months or even years. However, its rock-hard consistency requires soaking in water or wine before consumption. And even then, it often contains small worms and insects that have found their way into the grain during storage. You learn to examine each piece carefully before eating, picking out the visible protein sources that have made their home in your meal. Water, perhaps the most precious commodity aboard the quarantine galley, is strictly rationed. Each passenger receives a daily allowance measured in small ceramic cups, barely enough for drinking, let alone washing. The water itself, stored in large wooden barrels, has been treated with vinegar to prevent spoilage, giving it a sharp, acidic taste that never quite becomes palatable. The barrels, having been used for previous voyages, impart their own flavors to the water, creating a complex and often unpleasant drinking experience. The rationing system creates a hierarchy of thirst that governs much of the daily routine. Those who are more experienced with sea travel know to consume their water rations slowly throughout the day, while newcomers often drink their entire allowance quickly and spend the remainder of the day in increasing discomfort. The crew, with their knowledge of the ship's systems, sometimes have access to additional water sources, but sharing these resources with passengers is strictly forbidden. Under quarantine regulations, as night falls on your first day in quarantine, you begin to understand the rhythm that will govern your existence for the next 40 days. The ship's bell marks the hours, but time seems to move differently in this floating prison. The usual markers of daily life, meals, work, social interaction, are all constrained by the artificial environment of the quarantine galley. You lie on your straw mattress listening to the gentle lapping of water against the hull, and wonder how many others have stared up at these same wooden beams, counting the days until their freedom, and how many never completed that count. The question that haunts you as you drift toward an uneasy sleep is not whether you will survive the quarantine, but whether the person who emerges after 40 days will be the same as the one who entered. The physical hardships are apparent, but the psychological toll of confinement, uncertainty, and constant proximity to others in various states of health and despair promises to be the true test of your endurance. The ship's bell clangs at dawn, marking the beginning of your 7th day in quarantine. You've begun to measure time not in hours or minutes, but in the rhythmic cycles of discomfort that define life aboard the plague galley. Your body has adapted to the hard wooden planks, finding positions that minimize the ache in your joints, though true comfort remains elusive. The straw mattress has compressed under your weight, becoming little more than a thin barrier between your body and the unforgiving wood beneath. Morning brings the daily ritual of inspection, a process that has become as routine as it is humiliating. The health officials, wrapped in their protective garments and carrying their aromatic pomanders, move through the ship with methodical precision. Each passenger must present themselves for examination, extending their arms to reveal any unusual marks or swellings, opening their mouths to display their tongues, and answering questions about their physical condition. The inspection process reveals the gradual toll that quarantine life takes on the human body. Your skin, deprived of adequate washing facilities, has developed a grayish pallor that seems to be universal among the passengers. Small cuts and abrasions, common in the confined space of the ship, heal slowly in the humid, poorly ventilated environment. The lack of fresh food has begun to affect everyone's health, with early signs of scurvy appearing among some of the longer-term passengers. The merchant from Milan, who seemed robust and healthy during the first days of quarantine, has developed a persistent cough that echoes through the lower deck at night. His traveling companion watches him with growing concern, recognizing that illness in such close quarters threatens everyone's welfare. The health officials note the cough in their daily records, increasing their scrutiny of not just the afflicted merchant, but everyone in his vicinity. Hygiene, always a challenge aboard ships, becomes a daily struggle for survival and dignity in the quarantine environment. The ship's sanitation facilities consist of a simple wooden structure extended over the side of the vessel, providing minimal privacy and no protection from the elements. The process of relieving oneself becomes a carefully timed activity, dependent on weather conditions and the availability of the facility. Personal washing is limited to the small amounts of seawater that can be hauled aboard in leather buckets. The salt water, while abundant, provides little relief from the accumulated grime and sweat. Those passengers who brought their own supplies of soap find themselves carefully rationing small pieces of the precious commodity, using it sparingly, and sharing reluctantly with family members. The women passengers face particular challenges in maintaining their health and dignity. The lack of privacy makes attending to personal hygiene a constant source of stress and embarrassment. The absence of proper facilities for washing clothes means that garments must be cleaned in seawater and dried in the salt air, leaving them stiff and uncomfortable. The coarse fabric chafes against skin that has become sensitive from poor nutrition and constant dampness clothing, which began the voyage as a marker of social status and personal identity, gradually becomes uniform in its deterioration. The fine silks and wools that distinguished the wealthy merchants from the common travelers fade and tear under the harsh conditions. Everyone's garments take on the same gray, salt-stained appearance, democratizing the quarantine experience in unexpected ways. The ship's crew, though more accustomed to maritime conditions, faces their own unique challenges. They must maintain the vessel's operation while under quarantine restrictions, performing repairs and maintenance tasks with limited access to supplies. The crew's knowledge of the ship's systems provides them with some advantages, but they remain subject to the same health monitoring and restrictions as the passengers. Food distribution becomes a complex social ritual that reveals the underlying tensions of the quarantine community. The limited supplies must be carefully allocated, with consideration given to age, health status, and social position. The process of queuing for meals in the cramped conditions creates friction and competition among passengers who would normally never interact. The hardtack, now a familiar, if unwelcome part of every meal, reveals its own ecosystem of small creatures that have made their home in the stored grain. You've learned to break each piece carefully, examining it for the small worms and insects that have become an unexpected source of protein. The wine, distributed in small measures to help make the hardtack palatable, provides a brief respite from the harsh reality of quarantine life. Conversations among the passengers have evolved from the initial introductions and complaints to more philosophical discussions about fate, divine providence, and the nature of disease. The shared experience of confinement has created unexpected bonds between people who might never have spoken under normal circumstances. The nobleman from Florence finds himself discussing theology with a common sailor, while the merchant's wife shares her fears about her children with a young woman traveling alone. The psychological toll of quarantine becomes more apparent as the days pass. Some passengers withdraw into themselves, speaking little and eating less, while others become increasingly agitated and prone to outbursts of anger or tears. The constant uncertainty about the future, combined with the physical discomfort and lack of privacy, creates a pressure cooker environment where emotions run high. Sleep, when it comes, is fitful and frequently interrupted. The ship's creaking and groaning as it rides at anchor provides a constant background soundtrack, while the sounds of other passengers coughing, snoring, or talking in their sleep create an environment that never truly becomes quiet. Dreams, when they occur, often feature themes of escape, return home, or the plague itself, reflecting the preoccupations that dominate waking hours. The weather adds another variable to the already complex equation of quarantine life. Storms bring seasickness. Two passengers unaccustomed to the ship's motion, while calm days can become oppressively hot in the poorly ventilated lower deck. Rain provides opportunities to collect fresh water, but also creates leaks that soak bedding and personal belongings. The ship's bell continues to mark the passage of time, but its meaning has changed from a simple timekeeper to a countdown toward freedom. Each toll represents another hour survived, another small victory in the struggle to maintain health and sanity in the artificial environment of the quarantine galley. Yet with each passing day, the toll also brings new challenges and the growing realization that 40 days might be just the beginning of a longer ordeal. As you settle into your straw mattress for another night, you find yourself wondering not just about your own fate, but about the larger questions that quarantine raises, about human nature, social organization, and the price of public health. The ship has become a microcosm of society with its own rules, hierarchies, and social dynamics, all compressed into a space barely larger than a modest house. The morning of your 38th day in quarantine arrives with a peculiar mix of anticipation and dread. You've survived more than 5 weeks in the floating prison, but the end of your ordeal remains uncertain. The health officials have become more frequent in their visits, their examinations more thorough, their questions more probing. The merchant from Milan, whose cough dominated the night sounds for weeks, has been moved to the isolation section of the ship, a cramped space in the forward hold where those suspected of carrying disease are separated from the general population. The isolation section represents the quarantine system's most feared destination. Those passengers who develop symptoms during the 40-day period are immediately separated from the main group. Their already limited space reduced to a narrow berth, barely large enough for a prone body. The isolation area receives even less ventilation than the main passenger quarters, creating an environment where the stench of sickness mingles with the existing odors of the ship. From your position in the main passenger area, you can hear the isolated passengers through the thin wooden partition that separates you from their suffering. Their coughs and moans provide a constant reminder of the disease that the quarantine system is designed to contain. The woman from Florence, who had been moved to isolation a week earlier, has fallen silent, and you wonder whether her silence represents recovery or a more permanent form of peace. The psychological weight of approaching the end of quarantine creates unexpected tensions among the remaining passengers. Those who have maintained their health begin to distance themselves from anyone showing the slightest sign of illness, creating a social hierarchy based on apparent wellness. Friendships formed during the early days of confinement strain under the pressure of proximity to freedom and the fear of last-minute infection. The daily inspection process has become more intense as the quarantine period nears its end. The health officials examine not just obvious symptoms, but subtle signs that might indicate the early stages of disease. They palpitate lymph nodes, examine the skin for unusual marks, and ask detailed questions about appetite, sleep patterns, and general well-being. The examination process, which once seemed like a routine inconvenience, has become a daily test that determines whether you move closer to freedom or join the isolated passengers in their uncertain fate. Your body bears the marks of the extended confinement. The initial weight loss has stabilized, but at a level that leaves you feeling weak and easily fatigued. Your skin, deprived of sunlight and proper nutrition, has taken on a sallow appearance that seems to be universal among the quarantine survivors. Small injuries and abrasions heal slowly, and you've developed a persistent cough that worries you despite its apparent mildness. The crew, who have endured the same confinement as the passengers while maintaining their duties, show signs of the extended ordeal. Their familiar efficiency has been replaced by a weary competence that gets the necessary work done without the energy for anything beyond the essential tasks. The captain, who initially maintained a professional distance from the passengers, has become more involved in the daily life of the ship. Perhaps recognizing that the traditional hierarchies of maritime life have been altered by the shared experience of quarantine, food preparation has become increasingly challenging as supplies dwindle and the quality of remaining provisions deteriorates. The hardtack, never pleasant, has become increasingly infested with insects and shows signs of mold in the humid conditions. The crew has begun supplementing meals with fish caught from the ship's sides, though the health officials view this addition with suspicion. Concerned that fresh food might introduce new sources of contamination, the water situation has become critical. The barrels that seemed adequate at the beginning of the quarantine period are now showing signs of depletion, and the quality of the remaining water has deteriorated significantly. The vinegar treatment that was supposed to prevent spoilage has created a liquid that burns the throat and leaves a persistent aftertaste. Some passengers have begun to refuse their water ration, preferring thirst to the unpleasant experience of consuming the degraded liquid. As the 40th day approaches, the conversations among passengers turn increasingly to the world beyond the ship. Plans are made for immediate activities upon release: visits to family, attention to business affairs, simple pleasures like a proper meal or a night's sleep in a real bed. Yet these conversations carry an undertone of uncertainty, as everyone recognizes that the end of quarantine doesn't guarantee immediate freedom. The Venetian quarantine system includes provisions for extending the isolation period if illness appears among the passengers during the final days. This possibility hangs over the ship like a dark cloud, creating a tension that affects everyone's behavior. Passengers who have developed even minor symptoms attempt to hide their condition, fearing that their illness might extend everyone's confinement. The ship's bell, which has marked the hours throughout the quarantine period, begins to sound different as the end approaches. What once seemed like a countdown to freedom now feels like a measurement of time that might stretch indefinitely. The regularity of the bell's sound, once comforting in its predictability, has become a reminder of the artificial nature of time. In the quarantine environment, on the morning of the 40th day, the atmosphere aboard the ship is electric with anticipation and anxiety. The final inspection is more thorough than any previous examination, with health officials spending extended time with each passenger. The process takes most of the day, with passengers waiting their turn in a state of nervous excitement that makes the cramped quarters feel even more confining. The examination results determine not just individual fate, but the collective future of everyone aboard the ship. The health officials confer in hushed tones, their decisions carrying the weight of weeks of observation and the authority of the Venetian Republic. As afternoon turns to evening, the passengers wait for the verdict that will determine whether 40 days of hardship has earned them their freedom or merely the right to continue their confinement. The announcement, when it comes, is delivered with the same official formality that has characterized all interactions with the health authorities. The ship is declared free of plague, and the passengers are authorized to disembark on the following morning. The news brings a mixture of relief and disbelief, as if the idea of freedom has become so distant that it seems almost impossible to achieve. As you prepare for your last night aboard the quarantine galley, you reflect on the transformation that 40 days of confinement has wrought. The physical changes are obvious: the weight loss, the pallor, the general deterioration of health that affects everyone who has endured the quarantine. But the psychological and social changes run deeper, creating connections between strangers and revealing aspects of human nature that might otherwise remain hidden. The experience has demonstrated both the resilience and fragility of human beings when faced with extended hardship. Some passengers have emerged from the ordeal with a strength they didn't know they possessed, while others have been fundamentally changed by the experience of powerlessness and uncertainty. The quarantine has been a leveling experience, reducing all participants to their most basic human elements while revealing the social structures that persist even in the most constrained circumstances. As you lie on your straw mattress for the final time, listening to the familiar sounds of the ship and the sleeping passengers around you, you wonder about the broader implications of the quarantine system. The 40-day period has protected Venice from the spread of disease, but at what cost to those who have endured the confinement? The balance between public health and individual freedom has been weighted heavily toward the collective good, and you've experienced firsthand the price of that choice. The morning sun that will greet you upon disembarkation will illuminate not just your freedom, but a world that has continued its normal course while you remain suspended in the artificial environment of the quarantine galley. The challenge now will be to integrate the lessons learned during 40 days of confinement into a life that has been fundamentally altered by the experience of sleeping in a plague ship. The summer of 1800 finds you aboard the merchant vessel Hannah Maria, approaching the Delaware River after a 3-week voyage from the Caribbean port of Saint Domingue. The yellow fever epidemic that has been ravaging the Caribbean islands has followed you north, and as Philadelphia comes into view through the morning haze, you realize that your journey is far from over. The ship's captain, a weathered man named Morrison, has been growing increasingly nervous as several passengers have fallen ill during the voyage, their skin taking on the characteristic yellow tinge that gives the disease its name. The lazaretto, as the quarantine station is known, sits on a 10-acre island in the Delaware River. Its imposing brick structure rising from the water like a fortress designed to contain disease rather than repel invaders. The building, constructed in 1799, represents the most advanced thinking in quarantine design, with its 3.5-story main structure featuring carefully planned ventilation systems and isolation wards. But from your position on the ship's deck, it looks less like a hospital and more like a prison. As the Hannah Maria approaches the quarantine station, you can see other vessels already at anchor, their yellow flags flying to indicate their disease-ridden status. The sight of these ships, some of which have been waiting for weeks, creates a sense of foreboding that settles over the passengers like a shroud. The carefully planned 3-week voyage has become an indefinite period of confinement, and you begin to understand that the yellow fever that seemed like a distant threat in the Caribbean has become your immediate reality. The quarantine physician, Dr. Benjamin Rush's protege, Dr. William Curry, boards the ship with his assistant, both men wrapped in protective clothing that makes them look like specters of death. Their examination is thorough and efficient, developed through years of experience with yellow fever cases. They examine each passenger for the telltale signs: the yellowing of the skin and eyes, the fever that comes in waves, the black vomit that indicates the disease has reached its most dangerous stage. Dr. Curry's examination reveals what Captain Morrison has feared. 3 passengers are showing clear signs of yellow fever, and several others, including yourself, are exhibiting symptoms that could indicate the early stages of the disease. The decision is immediate and non-negotiable: the entire ship's complement, will be transferred to the lazaretto for an extended quarantine period that could last anywhere from 2 weeks to 2 months, depending on the progression of the disease. Among the passengers, the transfer to the lazaretto is accomplished by small boats that ferry passengers and their belongings to the island. The process is carefully orchestrated to minimize contact between the potentially infected passengers and the quarantine station staff. Your personal belongings, such as they are fumigated with sulfur and aromatic herbs before being allowed into the facility, a process that leaves everything smelling of chemicals and smoke. The lazaretto's main building is an impressive structure. For its time, designed with the latest understanding of disease, transmission, and treatment. The ground floor houses the administrative offices and the initial examination rooms, while the upper floors contain the patient wards and isolation rooms. The building's most innovative feature is its ventilation system, which uses a series of carefully placed windows and air shafts to create a constant flow of fresh air. Through the patient areas, your assigned quarters in the lazaretto represent a significant improvement over the ship's cramped conditions, yet they carry their own unique challenges. The room, which you share with 2 other passengers from the Hannah Maria, measures roughly 12 feet by 10 feet and contains 3 iron bedsteads with straw mattresses. The walls are whitewashed brick, and the single window provides both light and ventilation, though the view is limited to the Delaware River and the distant shoreline. The bedding provided by the lazaretto consists of sheets, blankets, and pillows that have been repeatedly washed and fumigated. The process leaves the fabric with a chemical smell that never quite dissipates. And the constant washing has made the material rough and uncomfortable against skin that has become sensitive from fever and poor nutrition. The iron bedsteads, while more comfortable than the wooden platforms of the ship, creak with every movement and conduct the cold of the brick building during the cool evening hours. The lazaretto's daily routine is designed to maximize the health and recovery of its involuntary residents while maintaining the strict isolation necessary to prevent the spread of disease. The day begins at dawn with the distribution of medications, primarily doses of calomel and jalap, mercury-based treatments that were considered the most effective remedies for yellow fever. The medications, while intended to cure, often produce side effects that are as unpleasant as the disease itself. Breakfast at the lazaretto consists of simple fare designed to be easy to digest and prepare in large quantities. The meal, typically, includes porridge made from oatmeal or cornmeal, tea or coffee, and bread that has been baked in the facility's own ovens. The food, while adequate, lacks the variety and flavor that would make it appealing to healthy appetites, and for those suffering from yellow fever, the prospect of eating anything at all can be overwhelming. The medical staff at the lazaretto represents the best of early 19th century medical knowledge. Yet their understanding of yellow fever remains limited and often counterproductive. The treatments administered include bloodletting, purging, and the administration of mercury compounds, all of which are intended to restore the body's natural balance of humors. The treatments, while well-intentioned, often weaken patients who are already struggling with the effects of the disease. The isolation protocols at the lazaretto are strictly enforced, with different levels of quarantine depending on the stage of illness and the risk of transmission. Those passengers who show clear signs of yellow fever are placed in individual isolation rooms, while those who appear healthy but have been exposed to the disease are housed in communal quarters under close observation. The system is designed to prevent the spread of disease while allowing for the efficient treatment of those who become ill. The psychological impact of quarantine at the lazaretto is profound and immediate. The transition from the relative freedom of sea travel to the controlled environment of the quarantine station creates a sense of imprisonment that affects even the healthiest passengers. The knowledge that you are being held not because of any crime, but because of the mere possibility that you might be carrying disease, creates a unique form of anxiety that pervades every aspect of daily life. The other passengers at the lazaretto come from a variety of backgrounds and circumstances, creating a diverse community of individuals who share only the common experience of potential infection. The mixing of social classes and nationalities in the confined space of the quarantine station creates interactions that would be impossible under normal circumstances. The wealthy merchant finds himself sharing meals with the ship's carpenter, while the captain's wife discovers common ground with the emigrant woman traveling alone. The staff at the lazaretto, from the physicians to the kitchen workers, represent a dedicated group of individuals who have chosen to work in close proximity to infectious disease. Their daily routines require them to maintain strict hygiene protocols while providing care and comfort to people who are often frightened and confused by their circumstances. The staff's knowledge of the quarantine system provides them with a sense of control that is denied to the passengers, yet they too are subject to the risks of exposure and infection. As your first week at the lazaretto comes to an end, you begin to understand the rhythms and routines that will govern your existence for the foreseeable future. The building's bells mark the hours, the meals provide structure to the day, and the medical examinations offer both hope and fear in equal measure. The question that haunts your thoughts as you lie on your iron bedstead is not whether you will survive the quarantine, but whether the experience will fundamentally change your understanding of health, disease, and the delicate balance between individual freedom and collective safety. The sounds of the lazaretto at night, the coughing of patients, the footsteps of night staff, the distant sounds of ships passing on the Delaware River create a symphony of isolation that accompanies your attempts to sleep. The knowledge that you are surrounded by disease and death, yet still clinging to the hope of recovery and release, creates a tension that affects every aspect of your physical and mental state. The quarantine has become not just a medical necessity, but a test of human endurance and adaptability that will define your understanding of what it means to be vulnerable in the face of forces beyond your control. Your third week at the lazaretto begins with the arrival of another ship, the Belinda, carrying passengers from Barbados who present the same mixture of hope and dread that you remember from your own arrival. From your window on the second floor, you watch the familiar ritual of examination, fumigation, and transfer that has become the background rhythm of life at the quarantine station. The new arrivals remind you of your own transformation from a free traveler to a ward of the state, confined not by law, but by the invisible threat of disease. The yellow fever has claimed passengers from the Ana Maria during your time at the lazaretto, their deaths announced with the same formal efficiency that characterizes all official communications, serve as a stark reminder of the disease's deadly potential. The bodies, wrapped in sheets soaked with disinfectant, are removed from the facility for burial on the mainland. Their final journey witnessed only by the other patients who understand that their own fate remains uncertain. The medical treatments at the lazaretto have evolved during your stay, reflecting the ongoing debate among physicians about the most effective approaches to yellow fever. Dr. Curry has begun experimenting with cold water treatments, immersing patients in baths of river water that has been cooled with ice brought from Philadelphia. The treatment, while shocking to the system, is believed to reduce the fever and provide relief from the disease's most debilitating symptoms. The cold water treatments take place in a specially constructed room on the ground floor, where large wooden tubs are filled with Delaware River water. The process of immersion is both physically and psychologically challenging, requiring patients to overcome their natural resistance to the cold water while hoping that the treatment will provide relief from their symptoms. The treatments are administered 3 times daily, creating a schedule that dominates the daily routine of the more seriously ill patients. Your own health has remained stable during your stay at the lazaretto, though you've experienced the subtle changes that affect all residents of the quarantine facility. The institutional diet, while adequate, lacks the variety and nutrition necessary for optimal health. The constant anxiety about potential illness, combined with the restrictions on physical activity, has created a general malaise that affects even those who show no signs of disease. The communal dining room at the lazaretto serves as the social center of the facility, where patients gather 3 times daily for meals that provide both nourishment and the opportunity for human interaction. The room, with its long wooden tables and benches, can accommodate up to 60 people, though the number of diners varies depending on the current census and the health status of the residents. The meals are served by staff members who maintain strict protocols to prevent the spread of disease while ensuring that everyone receives adequate nutrition. The breakfast meal at the lazaretto has become a carefully orchestrated event that reveals the social dynamics of the confined community. The seating arrangements, while officially random, tend to reflect the natural groupings that form based on nationality, social class, and the ship of origin. The passengers from the Hannah Maria sit together, sharing memories of the voyage and speculating about the duration of their quarantine, while the newer arrivals from the Belinda clustered together. Still adjusting to their new reality, the dining room conversations provide insight into the diverse backgrounds and circumstances of the lazaretto's temporary residents. The merchant from Charleston discusses his concerns about business affairs that remain unattended during his confinement, while the young woman traveling alone reveals her fears about family members who expect her arrival. The ship's officers maintain their professional dignity despite the leveling effect of the quarantine, while the common passengers often express their frustrations more openly. The kitchen staff at the lazaretto faces the challenge of preparing meals for a population that includes both healthy individuals and those suffering from a disease that affects appetite and digestion. The menus are carefully planned to provide nutrition while being easy to prepare in large quantities. The lack of refrigeration requires daily deliveries of fresh food from Philadelphia, a process that must be carefully managed to prevent contamination while ensuring adequate supplies. The preparation of food at the lazaretto follows strict protocols designed to prevent the spread of disease while maintaining nutritional standards. All vegetables are boiled thoroughly, meat is cooked until well done, and dairy products are avoided due to their potential for spoilage. The cooking process, while necessary for safety, often results in meals that are bland and unappetizing, adding to the general sense of deprivation that affects all residents of the facility. The medical staff at the lazaretto has developed a routine of daily examinations that tracks the health status of every resident. The examinations conducted by Dr. Curry and his assistants include temperature checks, pulse monitoring, and observation of the skin and eyes for signs of yellowing. The process, while medically necessary, reinforces the sense of being reduced to a collection of symptoms rather than a complete human being. The isolation protocols at the lazaretto create a hierarchy of freedom based on health status and the perceived risk of transmission. Those passengers who remain healthy after 2 weeks of observation are allowed greater freedom of movement within the facility, while those showing signs of illness are confined to their rooms except for medical treatments. The system creates a social structure based on wellness that affects all interactions within the facility. The laundry facilities at the lazaretto represent one of the most challenging aspects of maintaining hygiene in the confined environment. All clothing and bedding must be washed in boiling water with strong soap, a process that is both labor-intensive and damaging to the fabric. The constant washing and the harsh chemicals used in the process result in clothing that becomes increasingly worn and uncomfortable as the quarantine period extends. The bathing facilities at the lazaretto consist of a series of individual rooms with large wooden tubs that can be filled with heated water. The bathing process is carefully scheduled to accommodate all residents while maintaining the facility's hygiene standards. The water, heated in large copper boilers, is often in short supply, requiring residents to bathe quickly and efficiently. The soap provided is harsh and strong-smelling, designed more for disinfection than comfort. The library at the lazaretto, a collection of books donated by Philadelphia's religious and civic organizations, provides one of the few sources of entertainment and intellectual stimulation available to the residents. The collection includes religious texts, popular novels, and educational materials. Though the selection is limited and the books show signs of heavy use, the act of reading provides an escape from the immediate concerns of quarantine life. Though the shared nature of the books means that popular titles are often unavailable when desired. The religious services at the Lazaretto are conducted by a rotating group of clergymen from various Philadelphia denominations, reflecting the diverse religious backgrounds of the residents. The services, held in the main dining room, provide comfort and hope to those facing the uncertainty of their situation. The sermons often focus on themes of divine providence, the temporary nature of earthly suffering, and the importance of faith in times of crisis. The correspondence policies at the Lazaretto allow residents to maintain contact with the outside world, though all letters must be fumigated before being sent or received. The process of fumigation, involving exposure to sulfur and aromatic herbs, often damages the paper and makes the ink run, creating letters that are difficult to read and emotionally unsatisfying. The knowledge that their correspondence is being monitored and treated adds another layer of isolation to the quarantine experience. As your fourth week at the Lazaretto begins, you find yourself settling into routines that would have seemed impossible during your first days of confinement. The institutional schedule has become natural. The communal living arrangements have become familiar, and the constant awareness of disease has become a background concern rather than an immediate terror. The transformation from a free individual to a ward of the state has been gradual but complete, and you wonder whether the person who eventually leaves the Lazaretto will be fundamentally different from the one who arrived. The question that occupies your thoughts as you lie on your iron bedstead is not whether you will survive the quarantine, but what kind of person you will become during the process. The Lazaretto has become not just a place of medical treatment, but a crucible that tests human adaptability and reveals the social structures that emerge when people are stripped of their normal roles and confined together in artificial circumstances. The morning of your 42nd day at the Lazaretto arrives with the sound of rain against the windows, a steady percussion that has become the soundtrack to your extended confinement. The weather, which initially seemed like a minor inconvenience, has begun to affect the psychological state of the residents, creating a sense of enclosure that compounds the already restrictive nature of the quarantine. The Delaware River, visible through the rain-streaked windows, seems to mock your confinement with its constant flow toward the freedom of the open sea. The yellow fever epidemic that brought you to the Lazaretto has run its course through the sea facility with the methodical efficiency of a military campaign. Of the original 37 passengers from the Hannah Maria, 12 have succumbed to the disease, their deaths marking the progression of the epidemic through the confined population. The survivors, including yourself, have developed a grim familiarity with the stages of the disease and the signs that indicate whether a patient will recover or join the growing number of casualties. The medical treatments at the Lazaretto have evolved throughout your stay, reflecting both the experience gained from treating numerous cases and the ongoing debate among physicians about the most effective approaches. Dr. Curry has abandoned some of the more aggressive treatments, such as excessive bloodletting and mercury purging, in favor of supportive care that focuses on maintaining the patient's strength and comfort. The change in approach reflects a growing understanding that the disease must run its course, and that medical intervention should support rather than interfere with the body's natural healing processes. The isolation protocols have been refined, based on the patterns of infection observed during your extended stay. The facility has developed a system of graduated isolation that allows for different levels of contact based on the stage of illness and the length of time since exposure. Those passengers who have remained healthy for more than 30 days are granted additional freedoms, while new arrivals are subject to the strictest isolation protocols until their health status can be determined. Your own health has remained stable throughout your stay, though you've experienced the subtle but significant changes that affect all long-term residents of the facility. The institutional diet, while adequate for survival, has resulted in a general decline in physical condition that affects energy levels and overall well-being. The lack of physical activity, combined with the constant stress of confinement, has created a sense of physical and mental fatigue that pervades every aspect of daily life. The social dynamics within the lazaretto have evolved to reflect the reality of extended confinement. The initial friendships formed during the early days of quarantine have either deepened into genuine bonds or dissolved under the pressure of close proximity and shared stress. The artificial community created by the quarantine has developed its own hierarchies, leadership structures, and social norms that govern interactions between residents. The dining room, its conversations have shifted from speculation about the duration of quarantine to more philosophical discussions about the nature of disease, the role of divine providence in human affairs, and the meaning of the shared experience. The passengers who have survived the epidemic often express a sense of gratitude mixed with guilt about their survival, while those who remain healthy live with the constant awareness that their status could change at any moment. The correspondence system at the lazaretto has become a crucial link to the outside world. Though the fumigation process continues to damage letters and create frustrating delays in communication, the letters that arrive from family and friends provide news of a world that continues to function normally while the residents remain suspended in their artificial environment. The contrast between the normal concerns expressed in the letters and the life and death struggles of the quarantine creates a sense of disconnection that affects all residents. The economic impact of the extended quarantine has become a significant concern for many residents. The merchants worry about business opportunities lost and contracts that remain unfulfilled, while the working passengers face the prospect of unemployment and financial hardship upon their eventual release. The facility's policies provide for basic necessities during the quarantine period, but offer no compensation for the economic losses that result from the extended confinement. The psychological toll of the extended quarantine has begun to manifest in various ways among the residents. Some individuals have withdrawn into themselves, speaking little and participating minimally in the facility's activities. Others have become increasingly agitated, expressing frustration with the restrictions and demanding immediate release. The medical staff has observed that the psychological effects of confinement can be as debilitating as the physical symptoms of the disease itself. The cleaning and maintenance routines at the lazaretto have become increasingly important as the facility's population has remained stable for an extended period. The constant use of the building and facilities requires daily attention to prevent the deterioration of conditions that could affect the health and morale of the residents. The staff has developed efficient systems for maintaining hygiene standards while minimizing disruption to the daily routine. The educational activities at the lazaretto have emerged as an important component of the facility's approach to long-term confinement. The residents have organized informal classes in various subjects, sharing knowledge and skills that help pass the time and provide intellectual stimulation. The merchant from Charleston has begun teaching basic accounting principles, while the ship's carpenter has organized woodworking sessions, using materials salvaged from packing crates. The religious services at the lazaretto have taken on greater significance as the quarantine period has extended. The weekly services provide not only spiritual comfort, but also a sense of community and shared purpose that helps maintain morale during the difficult period. The sermons have evolved to address the specific concerns of the confined population, focusing on themes of patience, endurance, and faith in the face of uncertainty. The medical examinations have become routine, events that mark the passage of time rather than sources of anxiety about health status. The daily temperature checks and weekly comprehensive examinations provide structure to the institutional routine while offering hope that the end of quarantine might be approaching. The medical staff has developed a relationship with the long-term residents that combines professional care with personal familiarity. The approaching end of your quarantine period has created a mixture of anticipation and anxiety that affects all aspects of daily life. The prospect of returning to the outside world, while welcome, also raises concerns about readjustment to normal life after such an extended period of confinement. The institutional routine has become familiar and comfortable, and the thought of leaving the controlled environment of the lazaretto creates its own form of stress. The final week of quarantine involves a series of comprehensive examinations and evaluations designed to ensure that residents are free of disease and ready for release. The process includes not only medical examinations, but also assessments of mental and emotional fitness to return to society. The staff recognizes that the quarantine experience affects individuals in different ways and that some residents may require additional support during the transition back to normal life. The discharge process from the lazaretto is carefully orchestrated to prevent any possibility of disease transmission while ensuring that residents are prepared for their return to society. Personal belongings are subjected to final fumigation. Clothing is washed and disinfected, and each individual receives a clean bill of health that certifies their fitness for release. The process, while thorough, cannot address the psychological and social changes that have occurred during the extended confinement. As you prepare to leave the lazaretto after 6 weeks of confinement, you reflect on the transformation that has occurred during your stay. The experience has revealed aspects of human nature and social organization that would have remained hidden under normal circumstances. The artificial community created by the quarantine has demonstrated both the resilience and fragility of human bonds when subjected to extreme stress. The knowledge that you carry with you as you prepare to return to the outside world includes not only the immediate experience of quarantine, but also a deeper understanding of the delicate balance between individual freedom and collective safety. The lazaretto has served its purpose in protecting Philadelphia from the spread of yellow fever, but at the cost of temporarily removing a significant number of individuals from their normal lives and subjecting them to an experience that has fundamentally altered their understanding of health, disease, and the role of government in protecting public welfare. The question that will follow you as you leave the lazaretto is whether the lessons learned during your confinement will prove valuable in your future life, or whether the experience will remain an isolated chapter that bears little relationship to the normal course of human existence. The answer to that question will determine whether the quarantine has been simply an interruption in your life or a formative experience that will influence your future understanding of what it means to be human in the face of forces beyond individual control. The year is 1849. You find yourself in the cramped steerage compartment of the steamship Europa, bound from Liverpool to New York with a human cargo of 847 passengers seeking new lives in America. The cholera outbreak that has swept through Europe has followed you aboard, transforming what was intended to be a voyage of hope into a floating nightmare of disease and death. The steerage quarters, where you and hundreds of other passengers are confined, represent the lowest class of accommodation available on the transatlantic steamers, a space designed to maximize profit rather than comfort or health. The steerage compartment occupies the lowest level of the ship, below the waterline and adjacent to the engine room. The space, measuring roughly 80 feet by 40 feet, houses 200 passengers in conditions that would be considered inhumane for livestock. The ceiling height varies from 5 to 7 feet, forcing taller passengers to walk in a permanent stoop while navigating the narrow passageways between the sleeping berths. The air, thick with the combined odors of unwashed bodies, vomit, and the ever-present smell of the ship's engines, creates an atmosphere that seems to press against your lungs with each breath. Your assigned berth, shared with a stranger from County Cork, consists of a wooden frame roughly 6 feet long and 2 feet wide, with a thin straw mattress and a single blanket that provides little protection from the cold and dampness that penetrates the lower levels of the ship. The berths are stacked 3 high, creating a maze of human storage that maximizes the use of the available space while minimizing any consideration for privacy or comfort. The wooden construction, while sturdy, has been worn smooth by countless previous passengers, creating surfaces that are impossible to clean effectively. The mattress, stuffed with straw that has been used by previous passengers, crackles with each movement and releases dust that irritates the eyes and throat. The straw, intended to provide some cushioning between your body and the hard wooden frame, has been compressed by use and moisture until it offers little more comfort than sleeping directly on the planks. The blanket, made of coarse wool, that has been washed repeatedly in seawater, provides minimal warmth and carries the musty odor of previous occupants. The passenger manifest for the steerage compartment reads like a catalog of European hardship. Irish families fleeing the potato, famine, German craftsmen seeking economic opportunity, and English laborers displaced by industrial change. The diversity of languages and cultures creates a cacophony of voices that fills the cramped space with conversations in multiple tongues, prayers in various traditions, and the universal sounds of human suffering that transcend linguistic barriers. The sanitation facilities for the steerage passengers consist of a handful of primitive latrines located at the far end of the compartment near the ship's stern. The facilities, little more than wooden boxes with holes cut in the seats, empty directly into the see-through pipes that often become clogged with waste and debris. The smell from these facilities permeates the entire steerage area, creating an atmosphere that makes eating and sleeping equally challenging. The process of using the sanitation facilities requires careful timing and considerable patience, as the limited number of facilities must serve the needs of hundreds of passengers. The lack of privacy and the poor maintenance of the facilities create conditions that would be considered deplorable even by the standards of the time. The absence of adequate washing facilities means that personal hygiene becomes virtually impossible, contributing to the spread of disease and the general deterioration of health among the steerage passengers. Water for drinking and washing is distributed twice daily from large wooden barrels, with each passenger receiving a small ceramic cup that must serve for both purposes. The water, stored in containers that have been used for previous voyages, often carries a taste of salt and other contaminants that make it barely palatable. The rationing system ensures that there is never enough water for proper hygiene, forcing passengers to choose between drinking and washing, a choice that inevitably favors immediate survival over long-term health. The food service in steerage consists of communal meals prepared in the ship's galley and distributed in large metal containers. The meals, while adequate in quantity, are prepared with little consideration for taste or nutritional value. The primary staples include hardtack, salt pork, and a gruel made from oatmeal and water, supplemented occasionally with potatoes or other vegetables that are often spoiled by the time they reach the passengers. The process of eating in the steerage compartment requires passengers to gather around the food containers with their personal utensils, creating a feeding frenzy that often results in the stronger passengers receiving more food than the weaker ones. The lack of tables or proper seating means that meals must be consumed while standing or sitting on the floor, adding to the general discomfort and indignity of the experience. The cholera outbreak that has affected the ship manifests itself gradually, with individual passengers developing symptoms that initially seem like common seasickness. The disease, characterized by severe diarrhea, vomiting, and dehydration, spreads rapidly through the confined population of the steerage compartment. The symptoms, while often fatal, can develop and progress within hours, transforming apparently healthy individuals into corpses before effective treatment can be administered. The medical facilities available to steerage passengers are minimal and often inadequate for treating serious illness. The ship's physician, when available, is primarily concerned with the health of the first-class passengers and views the steerage compartment as a necessary evil that must be endured rather than properly managed. The treatments available for cholera consist primarily of opium-based medications that provide some relief from symptoms, but do little to address the underlying disease. The death toll from cholera in the steerage compartment begins to mount during the second week of the voyage. The bodies of the deceased, wrapped in canvas and weighted with iron, are committed to the sea in brief ceremonies that provide little comfort to the survivors. The frequency of these burial services creates a constant reminder of mortality that affects the psychological state of all passengers, particularly those who are beginning to show early symptoms of the disease. The isolation protocols for cholera. Patients in steerage are virtually non-existent, as the cramped conditions make it impossible to separate the sick from the healthy. The disease spreads through the compartment with the inevitability of a natural disaster, affecting entire families and creating pockets of devastation that leave survivors traumatized and alone. The lack of effective quarantine measures means that exposure to the disease is universal, with survival depending more on individual constitution than on any protective measures. The social dynamics within the steerage compartment are fundamentally altered by the presence of disease and death. The initial camaraderie that develops among passengers sharing the hardships of the voyage gives way to suspicion and fear as the cholera outbreak spreads. Families begin to avoid contact with other passengers and individuals who show any sign of illness are treated with a mixture of sympathy and terror that reflects the universal fear of contagion. The children in steerage are particularly vulnerable to the effects of both the harsh conditions and the cholera outbreak. The lack of proper nutrition, combined with the unsanitary conditions and the stress of the voyage, creates an environment where childhood diseases can quickly become fatal. The sounds of crying children, often hungry or ill, provide a constant backdrop to life in the steerage compartment. Serving as a reminder of the human cost of the mass migration, the nights in steerage are particularly difficult as the darkness amplifies the sounds of suffering and makes the cramped conditions seem even more oppressive. The sounds of coughing, vomiting, and the final gasps of dying passengers create a symphony of human misery that makes sleep elusive for even the healthiest passengers. The knowledge that death is a constant presence in the confined space creates a psychological burden that affects all aspects of the voyage. Experience the ventilation system in the steerage compartment is inadequate for the number of passengers and the conditions they create. The few portholes that provide fresh air are often closed due to rough weather, creating an atmosphere that becomes increasingly stifling as the voyage progresses. The lack of fresh air, combined with the odors of human waste and decay, creates an environment that seems designed to promote disease rather than prevent it. As your first week in steerage draws to a close, you begin to understand that the voyage has become a test of survival rather than a journey to a new life. The cholera outbreak has transformed the ship into a floating mortuary, where the living and the dying exist in close proximity, and where the distinction between the two can change with frightening suddenness. The question that haunts your thoughts as you lie on your straw mattress is not whether you will reach America, but whether you will survive the journey in a condition that will allow you to begin the new life you sought when you first boarded. The ship that the steerage compartment has become a microcosm of human endurance and suffering, where the basic needs of survival must be met under conditions that challenge the very foundations of human dignity and health. The experience has already begun to change you, stripping away the optimism and hope that motivated your initial decision to emigrate, and replacing them with a grim determination to survive whatever the voyage might bring. The beginning of your third week aboard the Europa brings with it the grim realization that the cholera outbreak has moved beyond isolated cases to become a full-scale epidemic within the steerage compartment. The disease, which initially affected only a handful of passengers, has spread with relentless efficiency through the confined population, claiming victims with a randomness that makes every passenger a potential casualty. The morning count of the living reveals that 43 passengers have succumbed to the disease, their bodies committed to the Atlantic. During brief ceremonies that have become as routine as the daily distribution of food and water. The progression of cholera through the steerage population follows a pattern that has become grimly familiar to the survivors. The disease typically begins with mild digestive discomfort that could easily be mistaken for the common seasickness that affects most passengers during the early days of the voyage. Within hours, however, the symptoms escalate to severe diarrhea and vomiting that rapidly depletes the body's fluid reserves and leads to the characteristic dehydration that gives cholera victims their sunken, corpse-like appearance. The speed with which the disease progresses from first symptoms to death creates a constant atmosphere of anxiety and dread within the steerage compartment. Passengers who appear healthy in the morning may be dead by evening, their rapid decline serving as a stark reminder of the disease's lethal potential. The unpredictability of the disease's course means that every minor digestive upset becomes a potential death sentence, creating a psychological burden that affects even those who remain physically healthy. The medical response to the cholera outbreak reflects the limited understanding of the disease that characterizes mid-19th century medicine. The ship's physician, Dr. Thompson, visits the steerage compartment daily, but his treatments consist primarily of administering opium-based medications that provide some relief from symptoms without addressing the underlying disease. The doctor's obvious reluctance to spend time in the steerage compartment, combined with his focus on the first-class passengers, creates a sense of medical abandonment that adds to the despair of the affected passengers. The sanitation conditions, steerage, already deplorable under normal circumstances, become catastrophic as the cholera outbreak spreads. The primitive latrines, inadequate even for healthy passengers, become overwhelmed by the constant use of patients suffering from severe diarrhea. The waste management systems, never designed for the volume of discharge produced by cholera patients, begin to fail, creating pools of contaminated water that spread the disease throughout the compartment. The water supply, already limited and of questionable quality, becomes a source of particular concern as the epidemic spreads. The passengers begin to suspect that the water itself may be contaminated, though the ship's officers deny any problems with the supply. The rationing system, designed to ensure adequate distribution, becomes inadequate for the needs of cholera patients who require large quantities of fluid to replace what is lost through diarrhea and vomiting. The food service in steerage becomes increasingly chaotic as the epidemic spreads. The communal meals, already difficult to manage under normal circumstances, become impossible to organize when significant numbers of passengers are too ill to participate. The food itself, stored in conditions that promote spoilage, may contribute to the spread of the disease, though the passengers have little choice but to consume what is provided or face starvation. The social structure within the steerage compartment undergoes a fundamental transformation as the cholera epidemic spreads. The initial spirit of community and mutual support that characterized the early days of the voyage gives way to a more primitive survival instinct that pits passenger against passenger in the competition for resources. Families begin to hoard what little food and water they can obtain, while individuals who show signs of illness are avoided by their fellow passengers. The psychological impact of the epidemic extends beyond the immediate fear of death to encompass a broader sense of abandonment and despair. The passengers, already stressed by the harsh conditions of steerage travel, must now cope with the additional burden of constant exposure to disease and death. The knowledge that their lives depend on factors beyond their control creates a sense of helplessness that affects even the strongest individuals. The children in steerage are particularly vulnerable to both the physical and psychological effects of the epidemic. The high mortality rate among children, combined with the inability of parents to provide adequate care under the harsh conditions, creates family tragedies that affect the entire passenger community. The sounds of grieving parents, often themselves ill with cholera, provide a constant backdrop to life in the steerage. compartment. The isolation of the steerage passengers from the rest of the ship becomes more pronounced as the epidemic spreads. The crew members, fearful of contracting the disease, minimize their contact with the steerage compartment, visiting only when absolutely necessary and maintaining strict protocols to prevent contamination. The physical barriers that separate steerage from the upper decks become symbolic of the social and economic divisions that determine who lives and who dies during the epidemic. The disposal of the dead becomes a logistical challenge as the epidemic spreads. The ship's crew, responsible for conducting the burial services, must balance the need to remove bodies quickly with the practical difficulties of handling the increased number of deaths. The burial ceremonies, initially conducted with some degree of dignity and solemnity, become increasingly rushed and impersonal as the death toll mounts. The correspondence system, which allows passengers to send letters to family members upon arrival in New York, becomes a source of particular anguish for the survivors. The knowledge that many of those who wrote letters during the early days of the voyage will never see their families again creates a poignant reminder of the human cost of the epidemic. The letters themselves, written in hope and anticipation, become artifacts of lives cut short by disease. The economic impact of the epidemic extends beyond the immediate loss of life to affect the survivors' prospects for success in America. The passengers who survive the voyage often arrive in New York in such poor health that they are unable to work or care for themselves, making their transition to American life even more difficult than originally anticipated. The effect of selecting for survival those passengers who are physically strongest, while eliminating those who might have contributed significantly to American society. The religious practices within the steerage compartment take on greater significance as the epidemic spreads. The passengers, representing various Christian denominations and nationalities, find common ground in their shared experience of suffering and their need for spiritual comfort. The prayers and hymns that fill the compartment during the evening hours provide some relief from the daily reality of disease and death. The crew members who work in close proximity to the steerage compartment develop their own strategies for avoiding infection. These strategies, based on practical experience rather than medical knowledge, include the use of aromatic herbs, the consumption of alcohol, and the maintenance of strict personal hygiene. The effectiveness of these measures is questionable, but they provide the crew with some sense of control over their exposure to the disease. The ship's officers, insulated from the steerage compartment by their position and quarters, view the epidemic as a management problem that must be solved without affecting the ship's schedule or the comfort of the paying passengers. Their primary concern is preventing the spread of the disease to the upper decks, where the passengers have paid premium prices for their passage and expect to be protected from the problems of the lower classes the end of the third week brings. With it, a sense of grim acceptance among the surviving passengers. The epidemic has claimed approximately 1/4 of the steerage population, and those who remain have developed a fatalistic attitude toward their own survival. The initial shock and horror of the epidemic has given way to a more practical concern with the daily tasks of survival, though the underlying fear of death continues to affect every aspect of life in the steerage compartment. The question that dominates the thoughts of the surviving passengers is not whether they will reach America, but whether they will arrive in a condition that will allow them to begin the new lives they sought. When they first boarded the ship, the epidemic has transformed the voyage from a journey of hope and opportunity into a test of endurance and survival that will affect the survivors for the rest of their lives. The fourth week aboard the CHS begins with the sobering realization that the cholera epidemic has fundamentally transformed the nature of your journey and your fellow passengers. Of the original 200 passengers in the steerage compartment, only 127 remain alive. And of those, fewer than half are in good health. The disease has winnowed the population with ruthless efficiency, selecting for survival those passengers who possess either superior physical constitution, or simply better fortune in avoiding exposure to the most virulent strains of the infection. The steerage compartment, once crowded to the point of suffocation, now contains empty berths that serve as stark reminders of the lives lost during the epidemic. The vacant spaces, rather than providing relief from the overcrowding, create an atmosphere of desolation that affects the psychological state of the survivors. The empty berths, still containing the personal belongings of the deceased, become shrines to the dead that the survivors cannot bring themselves to disturb. The daily routine within the steerage compartment has been permanently altered by the epidemic. The communal meals, once chaotic gatherings of hundreds of passengers, now accommodate a much smaller and more subdued group. The conversations that once filled the compartment with the sounds of multiple languages and cultures have given way to a more somber atmosphere where survivors speak in hushed tones about their losses and their fears about the future. The medical situation begins to stabilize. As the epidemic runs its course through the susceptible population, Dr. Thompson, who had previously made only brief visits to the steerage compartment, begins to spend more time treating the survivors. Though his medical interventions remain limited by the knowledge and resources available, the doctor's increased attention to the steerage passengers seems motivated more by a desire to prevent the spread of disease to the upper decks than by genuine concern for the welfare of the survivors. The sanitation conditions in steerage begin to improve as the reduced population places less strain on the inadequate facilities. The surviving passengers, traumatized by the epidemic and desperate to prevent further outbreaks, develop their own hygiene protocols that exceed anything previously attempted in the steerage compartment. The cleaning routines, while still limited by the availability of water and cleaning supplies, represent a collective effort to create a more livable environment. The water distribution system, once a source of constant conflict and concern, becomes more manageable as the reduced population allows for larger individual rations. The survivors, having witnessed the rapid dehydration that characterizes cholera deaths, have developed an appreciation for the life-sustaining properties of water that goes beyond mere thirst. The daily distribution of water becomes a ceremony of survival that reinforces the bonds among the remaining passengers. The food situation also improves as the reduced population allows for more adequate portions and better quality meals. The ship's cook, no longer overwhelmed by the demands of feeding hundreds of passengers, can pay more attention to the preparation and distribution of food. The meals, while still basic, begin to include fresh items that were previously reserved. For the upper-class passengers, the social dynamics among the survivors reflect the profound changes that have occurred during the epidemic. The artificial barriers based on nationality and religion that initially divided the steerage passengers have largely dissolved under the pressure of shared suffering. The survivors have formed new alliances based on mutual support and the practical needs of daily survival rather than on the cultural differences that seemed so important at the beginning of the voyage. The psychological impact of survival creates its own challenges for the remaining passengers. Many survivors experience feelings of guilt about their survival when others, often family members, have perished. The random nature of the diseases impact makes it impossible to attribute survival to any particular virtue or behavior, creating a sense of arbitrariness that affects the survivors' understanding of justice and divine providence. The children who have survived the epidemic display remarkable resilience, though they have been fundamentally changed by their experience. The orphan children, cared for by other survivors, developed a maturity and self-reliance that seems inappropriate for their age. The surviving children often serve as sources of hope and motivation for the adult survivors, reminding them of the future that awaits in America. The disposal of personal belongings left by the deceased becomes a necessary but emotionally difficult task. The survivors must decide what to do with the clothing, letters, and mementos that represent the hopes and dreams of those who died during the epidemic. Some items are kept as memorials, while others are distributed among the survivors who can. Make practical use of them. The approaching arrival in New York creates a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. Among the survivors, the prospect of finally reaching America, while welcome, also raises concerns about how they will be received and whether they will be able to begin the new lives they envisioned when they first boarded the ship. The survivors worry about their health, their appearance, and their ability to function in American society after their traumatic experience. The ship's crew begins to prepare for the arrival in New York by conducting a thorough cleaning and disinfection of the steerage compartment. The process, involving the use of chlorine and other disinfectants, is intended to eliminate any remaining traces of the cholera epidemic and to prepare the ship for its return voyage. The cleaning process, while medically necessary, serves as a final reminder of the epidemic that has defined the voyage. The immigration authorities in New York have been notified of the cholera outbreak aboard the Europa, and special procedures have been established to examine the survivors before they are allowed to enter the United States. The survivors will be subjected to medical examinations and potential quarantine procedures that could delay their entry into America by days or weeks. The correspondence that the survivors have prepared for their families in America reflects the profound changes that have occurred during the voyage. The letters, written in the shadow of death and disease, convey a sense of gratitude for survival mixed with grief for those who have been lost. The survivors struggle to find words that can adequately convey the magnitude of their experience to family members who have never faced such hardships. The economic impact of the epidemic on the survivors becomes apparent as they prepare for their arrival in America. Many survivors have lost not only family members, but also the resources and support systems that were intended to help them establish themselves in their new country. The epidemic has created a population of survivors who are physically and emotionally damaged by their experience, and who will require additional support to succeed in America. The religious significance of survival is not lost on the remaining passengers, many of whom attribute their survival to divine intervention. The prayer services that have become a regular part of life in the steerage compartment take on the character of Thanksgiving ceremonies, though they are tinged with grief for those who have been lost. The survivors' faith has been both tested and strengthened by their experience. The crew members who have worked in close proximity to the steerage compartment during the epidemic have developed their own perspectives on the experience. Their observations of the epidemic's progress and the survivors' responses provide insights into human nature and the social dynamics that emerge under extreme stress. The crew's experience will inform their approach to future voyages and their understanding of the immigrant experience. As the Europa approaches New York Harbor, the survivors gather on the deck to catch their first glimpse of America. The sight of the Statue of Liberty, though still years away from its installation, is replaced by the more practical landmarks of the harbor and the bustling activity of the port. The survivors, weakened by their ordeal but strengthened by their survival, prepare to begin the next phase of their journey. The arrival in New York represents not the end of their journey, but the beginning of a new chapter that will be profoundly influenced by their experience aboard the cholera ship. The survivors carry with them not only the physical scars of their ordeal, but also the psychological and social changes that have resulted from their exposure to death and disease. Their experience will shape their understanding of America and their place in their new country. The question that will follow the survivors as they begin their new lives in America is whether their experience aboard the Europa will prove to be a source of strength or a burden that will affect their ability to achieve the success they sought when they first decided to emigrate. The answer to that question will determine whether the epidemic has been simply a tragic interruption in their journey or a formative experience that will influence their future understanding of survival, community, and the price of opportunity. The year is 1632, and you stand on the deck of the Genoese merchant galley Santa Maria della Grazia as it approaches the ancient port of Marseille. Your cargo holds filled with silk, spices, and precious metals from the Levantan markets. The morning Mediterranean sun casts long shadows across the water. But the golden light cannot dispel. It's a growing anxiety that grips both you and your fellow merchants as you observe the quarantine stations that guard the entrance to the French port. The sight of other merchant vessels anchored in the quarantine bay, their yellow flags fluttering in the breeze, serves as a stark reminder that your profitable trading voyage has now become a test of endurance and survival. The cargo aboard the Santa Maria della Grazia represents the culmination of months of careful negotiation and considerable financial investment. Your personal share of the cargo includes 50 bolts of Damascus silk, worth more than most artisans earn in a lifetime, and a collection of Eastern spices that command premium prices in the markets of Western Europe. The cargo holds also contain goods belonging to other merchants: Persian carpets, Egyptian cotton, precious stones from India, and the exotic items that fuel the luxury trade between East and West. The quarantine system that governs Mediterranean trade has evolved over 3 centuries of experience with plague outbreaks, creating a complex web of regulations and procedures that affect every aspect of commercial activity. The authorities at Marseille, like their counterparts in Venice, Genoa, Cannes, and other major trading centers, have developed sophisticated protocols for evaluating the health status of arriving vessels and determining the duration and conditions of quarantine. The system, while effective in preventing the spread of disease, creates significant financial burdens for merchants who must bear the costs of extended delays and the potential spoilage of their goods. The initial inspection of the Stesk Santa Maria della Grazia * by the port health authorities reveals no obvious signs of illness among the crew and passengers, but the ship's manifest indicates that it has recently visited ports in the eastern Mediterranean where plague has been reported. This information, combined with the suspicious death of one sailor during the voyage, leads to the immediate decision to impose a full quarantine period that could extend for as long as 50 days. The quarantine facility at Marseille, known as the Lazaretto, occupies a fortified island in the harbor. Its massive stone walls designed to contain both disease and the valuable cargo that must be processed during the quarantine period. The facility, constructed during the previous century, represents the most advanced thinking in quarantine design, with separate areas for different types of goods and elaborate ventilation systems, intended to prevent the spread of disease through contaminated air. The transfer of cargo from the Santa Maria della Grazia to the Lazaretto involves a complex choreography of boats, workers, and officials, all designed to minimize the risk of disease transmission while ensuring that valuable goods are properly protected. Your silk, carefully wrapped in protective cloths, is loaded onto special barges that transport it to the fumigation chambers where it will undergo the purification process that the authorities believe will eliminate any disease-carrying elements. The fumigation chambers at the Lazaretto represent the pinnacle of 17th century technology for dealing with potentially contaminated goods. The chambers, constructed of stone and designed to contain the aromatic fires that are believed to purify infected materials, can accommodate large quantities of cargo while ensuring that the fumigation process is thorough and effective. The chambers are equipped with sophisticated ventilation systems that allow the aromatic smoke to circulate around the goods while preventing the escape of potentially contaminated air. The fumigation process itself involves the burning of specific aromatic substances that are believed to have disease-fighting properties. The mixture typically includes juniper berries, rosemary, thyme, and other herbs that produce dense, aromatic smoke when burned. The process, while based on the medical theories of the time, often damages delicate fabrics and can affect the quality of goods that are sensitive to heat and moisture. Your silk, subjected to the fumigation process, emerges from the chambers with a permanent aromatic smell that will affect its marketability. The process, while intended to eliminate disease, has the unintended consequence of reducing the value of your goods and creating financial losses that must be balanced against the necessity of complying with quarantine regulations. The fumigation process represents the intersection of public health concerns and commercial interests, with the former taking precedence regardless of the economic consequences. The living quarters assigned to merchants during the quarantine period are located in a separate section of the lazaretto, designed to provide adequate accommodation while maintaining the isolation necessary to prevent disease transmission. Your quarters, shared with 2 other merchants from the same ship, consist of a stone-walled room with 3 narrow beds, a small table, and a single window that provides both light and ventilation. The accommodation, while basic, is significantly better than the conditions endured by the ship's crew, who are housed in communal dormitories. The daily routine at the lazaretto is governed by strict regulations that control every aspect of life during the quarantine period. The day begins at dawn with the ringing of bells that announce the distribution of the morning meal, followed by the daily health inspection that determines whether any residents have developed symptoms of disease. The inspection process, conducted by trained officials, involves examining the skin for unusual marks, checking for fever, and asking detailed questions about physical condition and symptoms. The food served at the lazaretto is prepared according to strict protocols designed to prevent contamination while providing adequate nutrition for the residents. The meals, while basic, include bread, vegetables, and occasional meat that has been carefully inspected and prepared by trained cooks. The food is distributed in individual portions to minimize contact between residents, and all utensils are carefully cleaned and sterilized between uses. The social environment at the lazaretto creates unique interactions between individuals who would normally be separated by social class and nationality. The merchant quarters house traders from across the Mediterranean world, creating a multicultural community that reflects the diversity of Mediterranean commerce. The shared experience of quarantine creates bonds between individuals who might otherwise be competitors in the marketplace. The correspondence system at the lazaretto allows merchants to maintain contact with their business partners and family members, though all letters must be fumigated before being sent or received. The fumigation process, involving exposure to aromatic smoke, often damages the paper and makes the ink run, creating correspondence that is difficult to read and emotionally unsatisfying. The knowledge that business communications are being delayed and potentially compromised adds to the frustration of the quarantine experience. The economic impact of the quarantine extends beyond the immediate costs of accommodation and food to include the broader consequences of delayed commercial transactions. The goods awaiting fumigation represent significant investments that generate no return while they remain in quarantine, creating financial pressure that affects all aspects of the merchant's business. The uncertainty about the duration of the quarantine makes it impossible to make reliable plans for future transactions. The fumigation process for different types of goods requires varying amounts of time and different procedures, creating a complex schedule that affects the release of merchants and their cargo. Silk and cotton fabrics require extensive fumigation periods, while metal goods and precious stones need less processing time. The staggered release of different types of cargo creates additional complications for merchants who have invested in diverse shipments. The psychological impact of quarantine on merchants, accustomed to the freedom and independence of commercial travel, is profound and immediate. The transition from the relative liberty of sea travel to the controlled environment of the lazaretto creates a sense of imprisonment that affects all aspects of daily life. The knowledge that release depends on factors beyond individual control creates anxiety that affects both sleep and appetite. The religious practices at the lazaretto reflect the diverse backgrounds of the merchant community, with facilities provided for Christian, Muslim, and Jewish merchants to practice their faiths. The religious services, while providing spiritual comfort, also serve as social gatherings that help maintain morale during the difficult period of confinement. The shared experience of quarantine often creates religious tolerance that might be absent under normal commercial circumstances. The staff at the lazaretto, from the administrators to the fumigation workers, represent a specialized workforce that has developed expertise in managing the complex requirements of quarantine operations. Their knowledge of the fumigation process, the handling of different types of goods, and the management of diverse populations makes them essential to the functioning of the Mediterranean trade system. As your first week at the lazaretto draws to a close, you begin to understand that the quarantine period will test not only your physical endurance, but also your financial resources and business relationships. The fumigation process has begun to affect your silk, and you worry about the market reception of goods that bear the telltale signs of quarantine processing. The question that dominates your thoughts is whether the financial losses incurred during quarantine will be offset by the eventual sale of your goods, or whether the experience will prove to be a commercial disaster that will affect your future trading activities. The lazaretto has become more than a public health facility. It has evolved into a complex social and economic institution that affects every aspect of Mediterranean commerce. The experience of quarantine has revealed the delicate balance between individual commercial interests and collective public health concerns, with the resolution of that balance determining the success or failure of both individual merchants and the broader trading system that connects the Mediterranean world. The beginning of your third week at the Marseille lazaretto brings with it a deepening understanding of the complex processes that govern the purification of goods and the management of human health in the medieval quarantine system. The fumigation chambers, which initially seemed like simple stone rooms designed for burning aromatic herbs, have revealed themselves to be sophisticated installations that represent centuries of accumulated knowledge about disease prevention and the treatment of potentially contaminated materials. The morning inspection of your silk reveals the ongoing effects of the fumigation process. The once pristine Damascus silk, renowned for its lustrous finish and delicate texture, has taken on a brownish tinge that affects its market value. The aromatic smoke, intended to eliminate disease-carrying elements, has penetrated the fabric so thoroughly that the smell of juniper and rosemary has become a permanent characteristic of the material. The process, while medically necessary, according to the authorities, has transformed your premium merchandise into goods that will require significant price reductions to find buyers. The fumigation workers, a specialized group of individuals who have developed expertise in the handling of potentially contaminated materials, demonstrate a remarkable understanding of the properties of different goods and the appropriate treatments for each type. Their knowledge, passed down through generations of quarantine workers, includes detailed information about the effects of various aromatic substances on different fabrics, metals, and organic materials. The workers' expertise represents a unique body of knowledge that exists nowhere else in the Mediterranean world. The Persian carpets belonging to your fellow merchant, Giovanni Torriani, require a different fumigation process than your silk. The thick wool fibers can withstand more intensive treatment, but the organic dyes used in the carpet's intricate patterns are sensitive to the acidic compounds produced by burning aromatic herbs. The fumigation workers must balance the need for thorough purification with the preservation of the carpet's artistic and commercial value, a process that requires both technical knowledge and aesthetic sensitivity. The spices in your cargo present unique challenges for the fumigation process. The aromatic qualities that make Eastern spices valuable in European markets are the same characteristics that make them difficult to fumigate without affecting their commercial value. The fumigation workers have developed special techniques for treating spices that involve shorter exposure times and different aromatic mixtures. But the process still affects the flavor and aroma of the treated materials. The Egyptian cotton, belonging to another merchant, undergoes a fumigation process that involves spreading the fabric on special frames that allow the aromatic smoke to penetrate the fibers while preventing the direct contact that could damage the material. The process, while effective in achieving the desired purification, requires significant amounts of time and labor. Adding to the costs of the quarantine period, the precious stones and metals in your cargo require minimal fumigation, as they are considered less likely to harbor disease-causing elements. However, the elaborate jewelry and decorated weapons that contain organic materials such as ivory, leather, or wooden components must undergo the full fumigation process. The differential treatment of various materials creates a complex schedule that affects the timing of cargo release and the coordination of merchant departures. The workers who operate the fumigation chambers have developed their own culture and traditions that reflect their unique role in the quarantine system. Their knowledge of the effects of different aromatic substances on various materials makes them valuable consultants for merchants who are concerned about the potential damage to their goods. The workers' expertise is often sought by merchants, who are willing to pay additional fees for specialized treatment of particularly valuable items. The daily routine of the fumigation process begins before dawn with the preparation of the aromatic fires that will burn throughout the day. The workers carefully select the appropriate mixture of herbs and aromatic substances based on the type of goods to be treated and the specific requirements of the quarantine authorities. The preparation process requires both technical knowledge and practical experience, as the effectiveness of the fumigation depends on achieving the correct balance of aromatic substances. The monitoring of the fumigation process involves regular inspections of the chambers to ensure that the aromatic smoke is circulating properly and that the goods are receiving adequate treatment. The workers use their experience to determine when the fumigation is complete, relying on visual cues, aromatic intensity, and the length of time that goods have been exposed to the treatment. The decision to end the fumigation process requires a balance between ensuring adequate purification and preventing unnecessary damage to the goods. The ventilation systems in the fumigation chambers represent sophisticated engineering that allows for the controlled circulation of aromatic smoke while preventing the escape of potentially contaminated air. The systems include carefully designed openings that create air currents to carry the smoke around the goods, as well as filtration systems that purify the air before it is released from the chambers. The ventilation systems are maintained by skilled workers who understand the principles of air circulation and the effects of different aromatic substances on air quality. The record-keeping systems at the lazaretto track every aspect of the fumigation process, from the types of aromatic substances used to the duration of treatment for different categories of goods. The records, maintained by trained clerks, provide documentation that is required for the release of goods and the certification of their purification. The record-keeping system also provides valuable information for improving fumigation techniques and developing new approaches to the treatment of different types of materials. The interaction between merchants and fumigation workers creates a unique social dynamic that reflects the tension between commercial interests and public health requirements. The merchants, concerned about the value of their goods, often attempt to negotiate for reduced fumigation periods or special treatment that will minimize damage to their merchandise. The workers, bound by official regulations and their professional responsibilities, must balance the merchants' concerns with the requirements of the quarantine system. The psychological impact of watching valuable goods undergo the fumigation process creates stress that affects all aspects of the merchant's quarantine experience. The knowledge that the purification process is damaging the commercial value of their cargo, while being necessary for public health, creates a conflict that cannot be resolved through individual action. The merchants must accept the financial losses while hoping that the remaining value of their goods will be sufficient to make the voyage profitable. The religious and cultural significance of the fumigation process reflects the medieval understanding of disease as a spiritual as well as physical phenomenon. The aromatic substances used in the fumigation are often the same materials used in religious ceremonies. creating a connection between the purification of goods and the purification of the soul. The workers often begin their daily tasks with prayers that invoke divine protection and blessing on the fumigation process. The economic impact of the fumigation process extends beyond the immediate costs of the quarantine period to affect the broader patterns of Mediterranean trade. The knowledge that goods will be subjected to potentially damaging purification processes affects the types of merchandise that merchants choose to transport and the markets they select for their trading activities. The fumigation system has created a form of trade barrier that cues "my only lipstick," "ruby kiss," "ruby kiss," "ruby kiss," "only ruby kiss." Only ruby kiss has the luxurious texture "my lest lee." May leaves a loss, may lest, long last, lie. Affects the movement of goods throughout the Mediterranean world. The seasonal variations in the fumigation process reflect the medieval understanding of the NCH relationship between disease and environmental conditions. During the summer months, when plague outbreaks are more common, the fumigation process is more intensive and the quarantine periods are longer. The workers adjust their techniques based on the season, the weather conditions, and the specific health concerns that affect the region. The training of new fumigation workers involves an apprenticeship system that combines practical experience with the transmission of traditional knowledge. The apprentices learn not only the technical aspects of the fumigation process, but also the cultural and social dimensions of their role in the quarantine system. The training process ensures that the specialized knowledge required for effective fumigation is preserved and transmitted to future generations of workers. The end of the fumigation process for your silk brings with it a mixture of relief and concern. The goods have been certified as purified and safe for release. But the visible and aromatic effects of the treatment will affect their marketability. The question that dominates your thoughts as you prepare for the final phase of your quarantine is whether the remaining value of your goods will be sufficient to recover the costs of the voyage and generate the profit that motivated your initial investment in the Eastern trade. The fumigation chambers have revealed themselves to be more than simple purification facilities. They represent a complex intersection of technology, tradition, and commercial necessity that reflects the medieval world's approach to managing the tension between trade and public health. The experience of watching your goods undergo the purification process has provided insights into the hidden costs of commerce and the price that must be paid for the privilege of participating in the Mediterranean trading system. The morning of your 42nd day at the Marseille Lazaretto arrives with the long-awaited announcement that your quarantine period is nearing its end. The fumigation of your silk has been completed, and the health authorities have declared both you and your goods fit for release into the general population. However, the prospect of freedom brings with it a sobering assessment of the costs that the quarantine period has imposed on your commercial enterprise. The silk that entered the Lazaretto as premium merchandise has emerged as goods that bear the unmistakable marks of the purification process. The final inspection of your silk reveals the full extent of the fumigation's impact on your valuable cargo. The once lustrous fabric has developed a permanent brownish discoloration that affects its visual appeal and market value. The aromatic treatment has altered the texture of the silk, making it feel rougher and less supple than the original material. The distinctive smell of juniper and rosemary has become so deeply embedded in the fabric that it will likely never completely disappear, creating a permanent reminder of the quarantine experience. The economic calculations that will determine the success or failure of your trading voyage have been fundamentally altered by the quarantine experience. The silk that was expected to command premium prices in the European markets will now require significant price reductions to find buyers. The fumigation process has transformed your primary cargo from luxury goods into materials that will compete in lower-tier markets, substantially reducing your expected profit margins. The Persian carpets belonging to Giovanni Torriani have fared somewhat better in the fumigation process. as their thick wool fibers have proven more resistant to the effects of the aromatic treatment. However, the intense fumigation required for thorough purification has affected the brightness of the carpet's colors and created a permanent, aromatic residue that will affect their appeal to discriminating buyers. The carpets, while still valuable, will require creative marketing strategies to overcome the negative effects of the purification process. The spices in your cargo present a particularly complex challenge for post-quarantine marketing. The fumigation process has altered the aromatic qualities that make Eastern spices valuable in European cuisine, creating products that must compete with untreated spices while bearing the costs of the quarantine period. The spice trade, which depends on the preservation of delicate flavors and aromas, has been fundamentally affected by the necessity of quarantine treatment. The Egyptian cotton, subjected to the specialized fumigation process designed for delicate fabrics, has retained more of its original qualities than your silk, though it too bears the marks of the purification treatment. The cotton's natural fibers have proven more resilient to the effects of aromatic smoke, but the fabric has still suffered some deterioration in quality and appearance. The cotton will find markets, but at prices that reflect its altered condition. The precious stones and metals in your cargo, having required minimal fumigation treatment, have retained their full value and will provide the financial foundation for whatever profit the voyage might generate. The jewelry and decorated weapons, despite undergoing full fumigation for their organic components, have suffered less damage than the textile goods and will help offset some of the losses incurred by the fabric cargo. The documentation provided by the Lazaretto authorities certifies that your goods have been properly purified and are safe for commercial distribution. The certificates, bearing the official seals of the quarantine authorities, provide legal protection against claims of contamination but cannot restore the commercial value that has been lost during the fumigation process. The documentation will be essential for marketing your goods, but will also serve as evidence of their quarantine treatment. The other merchants at the Lazaretto face similar challenges as they prepare to resume their commercial activities. The quarantine experience has created a community of traders who share the common experience of financial loss and commercial disappointment. The conversations among the merchants increasingly focus on strategies for recovering their losses and adapting their future. Trading activities to account for the realities of the quarantine system. The psychological impact of the quarantine experience extends beyond the immediate financial concerns to affect the merchants' understanding of risk and opportunity in Mediterranean commerce. The knowledge that future trading voyages will be subject to similar quarantine requirements creates uncertainty that affects planning and investment decisions. The merchants must balance the potential profits of Eastern trade against the risks of quarantine-related losses. The staff at the Lazaretto, having completed their role in the purification process, provide advice and guidance to the merchants as they prepare for their return to commercial activities. The staff's experience with previous quarantine cycles provides insights into market conditions and consumer attitudes toward quarantine-treated goods. Their knowledge of the broader patterns of Mediterranean trade helps merchants understand the context of their individual experiences. The religious services at the Lazaretto take on special significance as the merchants prepare to leave the quarantine facility. The final prayers and ceremonies provide spiritual comfort and thanksgiving for survival, while also acknowledging the financial losses that have been incurred. The religious observances help the merchants find meaning in their experience and prepare for the challenges of resuming their commercial activities. The correspondence system at the Lazaretto allows merchants to notify their business partners and family members of their impending release and the condition of their goods. The letters, still subject to fumigation treatment, carry news of both survival and financial loss. The merchants must balance optimism about their release with realistic assessments of their commercial prospects. The preparation for departure from the Lazaretto involves a final series of inspections and certifications that ensure compliance with all quarantine requirements. The process includes health examinations, documentation, verification, and the final inspection of goods to confirm that they have been properly treated. The departure procedures, while routine for the authorities, represent a crucial transition for the merchants as they prepare to return to the outside world. The transportation of goods from the Lazaretto to the commercial markets of Marseille requires careful coordination to ensure that the purified materials are not contaminated during the transfer process. The merchants must arrange for appropriate storage and handling of their goods, while they assess market conditions and develop strategies for their sale. The transition from quarantine to commerce represents a critical phase in the recovery of their investments. The market reception of quarantine-treated goods reflects the broader social and economic attitudes toward the quarantine system. Some buyers are willing to purchase treated goods at reduced prices, while others avoid them entirely due to concerns about contamination or quality. The merchants must navigate these market attitudes while attempting to recover as much value as possible from their damaged cargo. The long-term impact of the quarantine experience on the merchants' commercial activities will depend on their ability to adapt their trading strategies to account for the realities of the quarantine system. Some merchants may choose to avoid routes that involve high quarantine risks, while others may develop specialized expertise in marketing quarantine-treated goods. The experience will fundamentally affect their approach to risk and opportunity in Mediterranean commerce. The broader implications of the quarantine experience extend beyond individual commercial concerns to affect the overall patterns of Mediterranean trade. The systematic treatment of goods and merchants creates costs and delays that affect the competitiveness of different trading routes and the types of merchandise that can be profitably transported. The quarantine system has become a permanent feature of Mediterranean commerce that affects all aspects of the trading relationship between East and West. The final day at the Lazaretto brings with it a mixture of relief and apprehension as you prepare to return to the competitive world of Mediterranean commerce. The silk that was intended to establish your reputation as a successful merchant has been transformed into goods that will require careful marketing and realistic pricing to find buyers. The question that will follow you as you leave the Lazaretto is whether the remaining value of your goods will be sufficient to recover your investment and provide the foundation for future trading activities. The fumigation chambers have completed their role in the purification process, but their impact on your commercial enterprise will continue to affect your business for months or years to come. The experience has provided insights into the hidden costs of Mediterranean trade and the price that must be paid for the privilege of participating in the commercial networks that connect the diverse cultures and economies of the Mediterranean world. The Lazaretto, as you prepare to leave it behind, has been more than a quarantine facility. It has been a crucible that has tested your endurance, your commercial judgment, and your ability to adapt to circumstances beyond your control. The experience has revealed the delicate balance between individual commercial interests and collective public health concerns, with the resolution of that balance determining the success or failure of your trading enterprise. As you gather your purified goods and prepare for departure, you carry with you not only the tangible results of your commercial venture, but also the intangible lessons learned during your extended confinement. The quarantine experience has been a formative chapter in your commercial education, providing knowledge that will influence your future approach to risk, opportunity, and the complex relationships between trade and society in the Mediterranean world. The question that will shape your future commercial activities is whether the lessons learned during your quarantine experience will prove valuable in navigating the challenges of Mediterranean trade, or whether the financial losses incurred will prove too significant to overcome. The answer to that question will determine whether the quarantine has been a temporary setback or a permanent obstacle to your commercial ambitions. As we reach the end of these 4 tales of sleeping in plague ships, we find ourselves confronting the timeless tension between individual freedom and collective safety that continues to shape our world today. The quarantine galleys of Venice, the yellow fever stations of Philadelphia, the Coloredon steerage compartments of the Atlantic crossing, and the fumigation chambers of Mediterranean ports all represent humanity's struggle to balance commerce, travel, and the fundamental human need for safety and health. The passengers and merchants, whose stories we have followed through these maritime ordeals, were not heroes in the traditional sense, but rather ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. Their experiences of sleeping in cramped, disease-ridden quarters, of watching fellow travelers succumb to illness, and of enduring the slow passage of days in quarantine, reveal the quiet courage that sustains human beings through their darkest hours. These were not the dramatic battles of history books, but the grinding daily struggle for survival that forms the foundation of all human progress. The evolution of quarantine practices from the medieval period through the 19th century reflects humanity's gradual understanding of disease, transmission, and the development of increasingly sophisticated approaches to public health. Yet the fundamental challenges remained constant: how to protect society from the spread of disease while maintaining the commercial and social connections that make civilization possible. The plague ships serve as floating laboratories where these challenges were played out in miniature, with each vessel becoming a microcosm of the larger. Society's struggle with disease and death, the physical conditions aboard these vessels, the cramped sleeping quarters, the inadequate sanitation, the poor ventilation, and the constant proximity to illness and death created environments that tested the limits of human endurance. Yet within these seemingly impossible conditions, passengers and crew developed social structures, support systems, and coping mechanisms that reveal the remarkable adaptability of the human spirit. The shared experience of confinement created bonds between strangers and revealed aspects of human nature that might otherwise remain hidden. The economic impact of quarantine on merchants and travelers represents a cost that is often overlooked in historical accounts of these practices. The fumigation of goods, the destruction of cargo, and the loss of business opportunities created financial burdens that affected not only individual merchants but entire trading networks. The quarantine system, while effective in preventing the spread of disease, created a form of economic friction that shaped the patterns of international commerce and influenced the development of global trade. The psychological toll of quarantine. Confinement emerges as one of the most significant yet least documented aspects of these historical experiences. The transformation of free individuals into wards of the state. The constant awareness of mortality and the uncertainty about the future created mental health challenges that were poorly understood and inadequately addressed. The survivors of these quarantine experiences carried with them not only the physical effects of their confinement, but also the psychological scars that affect their future lives. The social dynamics that emerged within quarantine facilities revealed the artificial nature of many social distinctions and the fundamental equality of human beings when confronted with disease and death. The mixing of social classes, nationalities, and religions in the confined spaces of quarantine created interactions that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. These encounters often led to greater understanding and tolerance, though they also sometimes reinforced existing prejudices and social divisions. The medical practices employed in these quarantine facilities, while often ineffective by modern standards, represent humanity's best efforts to combat disease with the knowledge and resources available at the time. The treatments administered, the isolation protocols implemented, and the fumigation procedures employed all reflect the prevailing medical theories of their respective periods. The failure of many of these treatments to prevent disease or death does not diminish their importance as expressions of human hope and determination in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. The role of government and public health authorities in managing quarantine systems reveals the complex relationship between individual rights and collective welfare that continues to challenge modern societies. The power to confine healthy individuals on the suspicion that they might carry disease represents one of the most dramatic exercises of state authority over personal freedom. The quarantine system demonstrates how societies have historically been willing to sacrifice individual liberty for the promise of collective safety. The religious and spiritual dimensions of the quarantine experience provided comfort and meaning to individuals facing uncertainty and potential death. The prayers, religious services, and spiritual practices that emerged within quarantine facilities served not only as sources of individual comfort, but also as means of creating community and shared purpose among the confined populations. The role of faith in sustaining human hope during these dark periods reveals the importance of spiritual resources in human survival. The legacy of these quarantine experiences extends far beyond their immediate impact on the individuals who endured them. The systems and procedures developed for managing maritime quarantine became the foundation for modern public health practices and international disease control measures. The lessons learned about the relationship between trade and disease transmission continue to influence global health policy and international cooperation in disease prevention. The stories of sleeping in plague ships remind us that the challenges we face in our modern world are not entirely new. The tension between individual freedom and collective safety, the economic costs of public health measures, and the psychological toll of confinement are themes that resonate through history and continue to shape our contemporary experience. The passengers and merchants whose stories we have followed provide examples of human resilience and adaptability that remain relevant to our understanding of how societies respond to crisis and uncertainty. As we reflect on these historical experiences, we are reminded that the progress of human civilization depends not only on the dramatic achievements of great leaders and inventors, but also on the quiet courage of ordinary people who endure hardship and uncertainty in service of the common good. The passengers who slept in plague ships, the merchants who watched their goods undergo fumigation, and the crew members who maintained these vessels under the most challenging conditions, all contributed to the advancement of human knowledge and the development of more effective approaches to public health and disease prevention. The question that emerges from these historical experiences is whether the lessons learned from centuries of quarantine practice will prove valuable in addressing the health challenges of our modern world. The answers to this question will determine whether the sacrifices made by those who slept in plague ships will contribute to a safer and more prosperous future for all humanity, or whether we will be condemned to repeat the mistakes of the past. Due to our failure to learn from these historical experiences, the gross reality of sleeping in a plague ship was not simply a matter of physical discomfort or even the risk of death, but rather a confrontation with the fundamental questions of human existence. How do we balance individual desires against collective needs? How do we maintain hope in the face of uncertainty? How do we preserve our humanity when reduced to the most basic level of survival? The answers to these questions, worked out in the cramped quarters and disease-ridden holds of history's quarantine ships, continue to inform our understanding of what it means to be human in a world where individual fate is inextricably linked to the welfare of the larger community.